Hello and welcome to another episode of Cook With Me Live. Now, I am very excited that the festive season is here and my goodness, it's fruitcake time. Now, I didn't used to be much of a fruitcake fan, but I tell you, I think the reason was because it seemed like so much work. So with this recipe, the festive fruitcake, I have worked very hard to make this the easiest, most simple possible fruitcake you could ever make. And funny enough, it's actually going to be a lot healthier than most fruitcakes you'll be having too, which I think is an added bonus. So instead of having to do all of the rigmarole, the routine, the tradition of, cooking this months in advance and then wrapping it in muslin and straining it and steaming it and steamed puddings and soaked alcohol, there's so much, usual rigmarole around that. Not for this recipe. So this, like I said, I've worked really hard to make this very simple and easy. So the one little thing with this though is that it's now more like a usual cake rather than a long preserved alcohol-based cake. And for this reason, not only is it good for the kids, but it's also something that you probably want to make either the day you serve it or the day before you serve it. But I'm going to show you how to make that really easy as well. Shall we get going? Who's ready to make fruitcake? Who's going to be cooking this at the same time as watching this video? Because it's honestly that easy, and this is something that you can get the kids help with as well. So particularly in the school holiday season, I would love it if you could put them to work and hopefully teach them a little thing or two on how to get excited about food in the kitchen, not to mention good quality food, that is. Now, the first thing I want to bring up about the fruitcake is that the quality of the fruit that you use is going to make the biggest difference overall to the end product. Now, most dried fruit, if it's conventionally dried fruit, is going to contain a lot of sulfites and a lot of preservatives. So if you're buying, for example, the dried apricots that are bright orange, those will have a lot of preservative in them because apricots and most fruit are meant to go brown when they're dried. So you might see them side by side in some shops and you wonder, oh, those ones look off because they're brown. But no, those are actually the better ones to get. So if you haven't already purchased those types of fruit, I would recommend that you try to look at all the ingredient lists on all the different types that you're about to buy and make sure that there's no preservatives in them, because that alone, that added sulfite load, there can be quite a bit, and in a cake like this, it's going to get very concentrated. So if you're going to have this combined with a bit of wine with those same type of sulfate-based preservatives in it, this could result in some pretty, headaches or other symptoms that people get from those added sulfites and the preservatives. The 220s, the 200s, pretty much all the 200s are your preservatives, okay? So that's just one thing to watch out for with your dried fruit, and particularly the ones that come as a pre-dried mixed fruit bag will have a lot of preservatives in them, and particularly the really fancy bright colored glass or glace fruit, those are going to be pretty high in food colorings and those types of things. So if at all possible, let's go for higher quality fruit, which probably is going to mean you'll have to search for organic. And it is going to mean that your cake is going to taste better, and we're not going to have to add as many other sweeteners to it. That's the other thing you might have noticed in this recipe is there's no added sugar. Other than the fruit juice and the actual fruit itself, there's no added other sweeteners of any kind. Okay, and that's I think one of the best parts about this dish, is we're getting the sugar in the form that nature intended it, which is fruit. And now it's become one of my favorite recipes. Without further ado, here we go. So what I've said here is you need about 500 grams of the dried fruit weight. So when you go to soak the fruit overnight, it is pretty important because we do need that moisture to kind of be absorbed into the fruit so it doesn't bake out and end up being quite a dry cake. So if I were you, I would get out your set of measuring scales, your kitchen scales, put your empty bowl on that, hit the 0 button, and then just start adding in whatever fruit you want to add until you get about 500 grams of dried fruit. You could go a little bit over if you wanted. So I've got a selection here of all different kinds of dried fruit that I've listed on that recipe. Now, you may or may not be able to tell the differences here, but we've got sultanas, we've got some little currants. So we've got our sultanas here, we've got our little currants that have plumped up. We've got some pieces of medjool dates that I've chopped up really small. I've got some crystallized ginger in there. There's a bunch of apricots, and I also snuck in some cranberries into that as well. So there is a selection, and this has been soaking in orange juice. I chose orange juice in this particular instance. I have done lots of different kinds of juices, and they're all great. So you can be very flexible with that, depending on what kind of flavor you're after. So let's start out with working with the rest of these dry ingredients. Now that the fruit has soaked, we've got this nice kind of juicy, plump effect. Most recipes, when it calls for the fruitcake part of this, would have you potentially draining off excess liquid. Do not do that in this case. That's why it has been measured very particularly. You've got exactly 2 cups of your liquid that's been soaking in, and we're going to use all of that in this recipe. So there's no waste, which I'm quite a fan of as well. You guys know when I get chuffed, right? It's when it's reducing waste, that's for sure. Okay, so we're gonna add to this. Now, have you ever made buttermilk pancakes ever before in the past? Do you know what buttermilk is like? It's a really handy ingredient for, I guess, creating a texture that's nice and moist. And I don't know in terms of a chemical structure what it's doing, but we do want to create more of a buttermilk effect here. So I've chosen organic soy milk because soy has a really high protein content, which means it's going to be more likely to create that creaminess and that curdled buttermilk effect that we're after. So we need about 3/4 cup of ideally the richest milk you can find, preferably not dairy. So the dairy curdling can have a different effect in the stomach, not as desirable in this case. So we're going to do 3/4 cup of the soy milk there. Now there is already some acidity because I chose the orange juice in this. So that's probably going to start to curdle that to begin with. But I also want to add in the extra 2 to 3 tablespoons of lemon juice just to kind of continue that process. So we could measure if you wanted. Let's aim for, oh, muscle workout. Let's put that down. Get an extra little squish. Depending on how juicy, the lemons at this time of year are not that juicy, so we might need to use a couple more, but that wasn't quite a full one either. If you are using one of these squishers, you can always get more out if you reposition the lemon. Oh, and by the way, the lemon doesn't go in this way, just because it fits the shape. I see some people do that when they're brand new to these machines. So the lemon has to go in upside down so the juice comes out the bottom. Once you've squished it once, then I take it out and I bend it kind of sideways into the squisher, and you get more out usually when you do that the second way. So it'll save you over the course of multiple lemons that you do. And here's another little trick or tip while we're at it, is the lemon oil on the outside of the lemon skin that will come out when you press it is really cleansing, and it's really antibacterial. So it's just a bit of a habit that I now have, that when I'm done with a lemon half, just to get a little bit more use out of it, I normally plunk it in my washing water because that is going to contribute a little bit of extra benefit, and it smells nice too. So let's get our 2 to 3 tablespoons of lemon juice. The other thing this is going to help with is the baking powder. Now, baking powder already has its acid in it, so all it needs is heat to activate. But it's just, this will help create those extra bubbles, hopefully that little bit of extra acid. Okay, so that's gonna be good enough. I won't need that second lemon there. So I can just give that a little stir. Now you can start to see, you may not be able to tell this in the camera, but you can start to see the kind of curdling or thickening happening on the level there where the lemon's touching the soy milk. So we'll just let that all happen throughout the fruit. And then we need to add our chia seeds and some oil to this as well. Okay, so although the chia seeds, technically speaking, are a dry ingredient, we usually, I can't think of many recipes where we wouldn't want to activate them in this sense. We want to kind of get that gelling process happening in the liquid ingredients before we add it to the dry ingredients. So 3 tablespoons of chia seeds into this mix. They'll start to absorb some of that liquid, and they'll hold it in the gel. Some of it will bake out, but they'll hold it in the gel to create the added moisture that we want in a cake. Usually we want it to be nice and moist. Particularly with gluten-free baking, it's pretty easy to create, you know, pretty dry cakes out of that. So the chia seeds are another sort of secret ingredient to this that I've worked very hard to try and find the right balance for, so we can create the moisture but still have a nice fluffy cake. So we'll stir those in, and then last wet ingredient is 1/4 cup of a neutral oil. So you could use a natural sesame oil, you could use macadamia oil. I've got some cold pressed sunflower oil here. So 1/4 cup is the same as 4 tablespoons. Okay, and I already had the tablespoon dirty. Saving you dishes every day. All right, so that's our wet ingredients. That's it. That is literally that simple. So we'll let that sit while we weigh out the dry ingredients. Now, if you're at the point where you want to bake this straight away, then we probably should preheat the oven. So this is going to cook at a little bit of a lower temperature because we've got those fruit in there and we've got a lot of excess moisture. So if you haven't already set the oven, we want to set it to about 170 degrees Celsius, which is about 340 degrees Fahrenheit. So we'll get that happening and then we're ready to rock. Now, in the event that you want to have, you're serving this, let's say on Christmas Day or the main festive occasion day, you probably want to have most of this prepared in advance. But it's nice to have a fresh cake, even potentially still warm when you go to serve it. So here's how you would do that. All of these wet ingredients can be made up in advance, and this can sit in the fridge even up to 2 days before you bake it. So you can do exactly as we've done here, put a lid on it, put it in the fridge for up to 2 days. You can do the same with the dry ingredients as well. So now what we're going to do is weigh out or measure the dry ingredients into another bowl, and then you could keep that dry ingredients aside in the pantry, covered up, sealed, so that all you have to do on the day of baking is combine wet into dry, put it in the oven, done. Okay, so I know it's technically one more step you have to do on the day, but oh my goodness, to have fresh, warm, festive fruit cake is just, it's gonna make all the difference in the world. And then you don't have to sit there and steam it and do all those fancy businesses to it differently. We can just cook it straight off the bat. Okay, so grab yourself another mixing bowl. Probably handy if we have a nice big one. And let's zero that one. Okay, so I really like to go by weight here because it's more accurate. You're gonna get a better result. You're gonna get a nice fluffy cake instead of something that's really rock hard or heavy by accidentally weighing or using too much if you measured by volume and it got a bit compacted. So with the almond meal, we need about 100 grams of almond meal. If you're really particular about the effect, you might want to get a blanched almond meal, but really not a big difference. I don't think you'll be able to tell the difference on that one. Now, sorghum flour, 1.5 cups, aka 210 grams. So I'm going to hit the 0 button on that one. And we want to go for 210 grams of sorghum flour. Now, if you don't have sorghum flour, you could use rice flour. Okay, but that's probably the only thing I would substitute that with because other flours will produce a bit of a different result. Yeah, I can't think of any other flour that would be appropriate in this case. You could maybe get away with buckwheat flour. Any other flour will either have too strong of a flavor or a different texture that would probably make it so you might not enjoy this as much. Okay, and then 140 grams of tapioca flour. Now, tapioca starch or flour has a tendency to go poof when you dump it from the jar. So I'm just going to scoop out a little bit here, up to about 140 grams, which should be about a cup. Okay. There we go. So much easier to go by weight. I find you just use a lot less dishes and everything too. Okay, and then 1.5 cups of nuts. Now, you don't have to put this in, completely optional. I like a little bit of crunch, if you will, into there, but I'm going to break up the walnuts a little bit. And I think in this case with a cake, you're probably better off choosing a softer nut than a really hard almond, for example. So this one would lend itself much better to walnuts or pecans, or what else could you use? Maybe crushed macadamias, they'd have to be crushed. Cashews would work really well, even pine nuts, but that's getting a little bit exy now for our fruit cake already. So about 1 cup to 1.5 cups if you want the extra bit of crunch there. Now, there is a secret ingredient to this cake. And at first you might look at it and go, I don't know about that. Not so sure if I'm going to add that as a secret ingredient. But I would encourage you to do it because it does provide that different dynamic that will make it unique. And everyone that I've had taste it has agreed that it's a good idea, except one picky husband of mine that says it could be better without the rosemary. So it just comes back to, I guess, your preferences. He still likes it and he still devoured most of the cake anyway, so don't get me wrong. But it can be a personal preference. I think it's a secret magic ingredient. So please, if you're feeling at any way, shape or form like you can bend tradition slightly. It's very festive. It's just more North Hemisphere festive. Okay, so now we need some spice. We need lots of delicious, yummy spice to make this a proper fruit cake and give it some oomph. So we're going to use a whole tablespoon of cinnamon. You could potentially add a little bit more. Whole tablespoon of that guy. So that's just a heaping tablespoon, let's call it that. Okay. 2 teaspoons of vanilla. So if you're using that as a wet vanilla or liquid vanilla, I should say, that can go into the wet bowl instead. Otherwise, we'll sprinkle the dry vanilla in there. Let's stay on the spices here for a second. About 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg. Obviously, this has to be ground. And if you've never smelled the difference between a freshly ground nutmeg, as in the nut itself, okay, so that's the actual nutmeg nut. I keep the nuts in and amongst the freshly ground powder so that when I run out of the powder, I can just grind up a few more, because the difference in smell and flavor is out of this world. You will not go back to buying pre-ground nutmeg ever again. And I just ground this up in a coffee grinder. So I have a separate coffee grinder for spices. They're pretty cheap and affordable nowadays. I don't mess with the actual coffee grinder, because then people's coffee ends up tasting like other things. So I've got a separate one for that. Just grind up as you need it, and it makes all the difference in the world. So I would recommend doing that. Okay. Coming back up to the order, let's use some psyllium husk here. If you haven't got it, you could use the xanthan gum, but let's use 2 teaspoons. Now, the reason for the psyllium husk is, in this case, in this quantity, it's less about the health benefits. In here, it's more about creating a little bit more of a bind. And because we've got whole chunks of fruit in this cake, we need that extra little bit of a bind with the otherwise gluten-free flours to make sure that it kind of holds together properly. And then a teaspoon each of both baking soda and baking powder. Now, because I'm doing this in a mixing bowl, this is going to be really critical that you get rid of any chunks or lumps or bumps in your baking soda and your baking powder. So I like to just run it through my fingers, rubbing out any of the lumpy bits, because there's nothing kind of worse than biting into a soapy tasting bit of baking soda. So this one's actually really quite lumpy and bumpy. Sometimes they're quite easy to work out. Okay, so that's one. And some of you might be actually wondering what is the difference between baking soda and baking powder, because they are very different. So baking soda is also known as bicarb soda. So those two are the same thing, same term, but baking powder is different. So baking powder has an extra ingredient in it, which is a form of acid, so that you don't need to add extra acid to the dish that you're making. And it makes it so that the chemical reaction usually doesn't happen to create the bubbles until it's been heated in the oven. So if we just used baking soda, we would have got the bubbles because we have acid in the dish, but we would have maybe not got enough bubbles that would last until it's in the oven. So that's why I've used both here in this case. And 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And again, hopefully your salt is evenly ground, otherwise you'll get salty bites. Now, you have the option to add some food grade essential oil to this. You do not have to, it does not need it if you're using a good quality range of fruit, good quality fruit juice, and the lemon juice that we talked about. So you do not need to add it. If you did want to, only about 3 drops. Okay, and it must be food grade. So this is not just any cheap essential oil that you get. It's got to be a food grade oil, and it's completely optional. Don't need to take my word for it. So that goes into the wet ingredients if you want. We'll give that a good even stir because it is an oil. We do want to make sure that it can be evenly distributed through there. Okay, now last but not least, we cannot forget the secret ingredient. So we'll mix all these in here, knowing that we've got some lumps, which are the nuts. But otherwise, we want the color and consistency of the flour to be even so that we know that everything's equally mixed. Okay, so you can see how this step could easily be done a few days before, and then all you have to do is combine the two together at the last minute. Okay, so our secret ingredient of rosemary. Thankfully, I don't have an abundance of rosemary in my garden, but I did have enough for this recipe. So I've just gone and harvested this. You'll know it's fresh because it's bright leaves. They haven't gone all dry and spindly, and they haven't gone dark by being in the fridges. You probably still want to give it a little rinse, just in case we have any little crittery things hiding out in there. And again, you'll know it's fresh if it's still slightly waxy in its feel. So there is a bit of a sticky wax sort of feel left on my fingers just by rubbing this. And that's okay. That's exactly that's what we want from a natural rosemary. And it's actually part of the way that the plant fends off predators, bugs, if you will. So we're just going to take the leaves off the stem. So if you pinch at the top and pull the leaves down, you'll get all those off the stem. Oh, wow. Wow. It does not get fresher than that. That is so exciting. Okay. And that waxiness on your fingers, so cool. Okay, so we really want to make sure that this is evenly chopped, really finely minced. So pile it into a little pile on the cutting board. You might even want to scrunch it up really, really well. Okay, you can be really tough with this. And let's be very fine with chopping it up because we do not want to bite into a whole chunk of this. Okay, so very important here that you just take that extra little couple of seconds to finely mince your rosemary. Now, if you've only got dried rosemary, you can still use it, but it'll make a massive difference. Okay, so if you want to wow the guests, it's also a really nice presentation piece. So as you can see probably on the photo that you've got there with your prep list, it's a nice presentation for when you serve the cake as well, to have a few sprigs of fresh rosemary on top as a little bit of a hint as to what the secret ingredient is. Some people might not even put two and two together. They might see that on top and just thought you've decorated it with it, but not actually realize that there's rosemary in the cake. So that's really, I'm just rock chopping through this, make it really fine and so fragrant. Wow. What a privilege, hey, to have herbs in our backyard. Maybe that's your project while you're on holidays upcoming, is to get some herbs going. Now, I've said 2 tablespoons. You could go with what you've got, but you probably don't want to go too much more than that, just if it's your first time. So let's put that, either one. Well, I'm going to put it into the dry ingredients so I can kind of evenly coat that in flour before we add the wet. Okay. And in this case, I'm not going to waste it, but I'm not going to put it in because I know that it could be overpowering for some people, especially if that's uber fresh. It will be extra strong in flavor. So in this case, I promise I'm not going to throw it out. It's going to go into my stock bag, but I'm not going to add it into the cake at the moment. So 2 tablespoons should be enough. All right, now, last but not least, we need a container to bake this in, a baking dish. Hopefully we haven't forgotten any ingredients. No, we should be good. Your choice. You get to choose the shape. I chose the red one because it's festive. No, it's okay. This is one of my favorite baking dishes because it's silicone on the outside and glass on the bottom. So it's beautiful to serve on, and then the edges, this just pops off to clean it. So you can just take it off and serve the cake like that. It's one of my favorite pieces. I actually couldn't tell you where to get it because I found it at an op shop. But I'm pretty sure that they're becoming more and more popular on the market now. So you should be able to find it. I imagine it would be called a silicone springform pan or something like that would be your search tool. It's my favorite. So that's about the shape and size, or it doesn't have to be this shape, but that's about the size that we want. And this will create a nice thick cake about that size. Okay, so if you go a bigger dish, you'll have a thinner cake. If you go a smaller dishes, you'll have a thicker cake, but you'll have to maybe adjust the cooking times slightly. Okay, so that's it. Here we go. Let's put 2 and 2 together. And we're going to stir fairly quickly, just so we can preserve any of the bubbles that we do get from the baking soda reacting with the lemon juice. Okay. And we'll stir fairly quickly to get this straight into the dish. and then straight into a hot oven. So it is pretty important in this case, if you want something to be light and fluffy when it comes to cake baking, that you do get it into a preheated hot oven for the best results. And this is also why I work with a nice big mixing bowl, as you can see, because it's a lot easier to not worry about mess, and I get the result much faster. Straight in. See how light and fluffy it is, like how airy? Whoops, I missed a bit of flour. Let's just mix that in. See how airy it looks? That's what we're after, and we want to preserve that and not lose that by the time it gets into the dish. And that's it. Got my trusty spoon, which acts as a spoon and a spatula in one, so I don't miss out on a single piece of cake. And then we'll just give it a little even down. See how airy and fluffy? Yes, that's awesome. That's what we want. That's because you were prepared and you acted quickly when you did it. I'm not talking to myself. I was talking to you there. It's okay. Not fully going crazy, although I am looking forward to eating this cake. So every little bit, let's get that in there. Smooth it out evenly. It's not going to change shape a lot, so you do want to kind of get the end shape that you're after even. It'll just evenly lift a little bit. And that's it. Festive fruit cake into the oven. It's going to need about an hour. So make sure that the oven is low enough. Make sure it's only at about 170 degrees. If you do happen to smell it really, really strong before the hour is up, you are welcome to check it and take it out towards the end. Okay, but we don't want to interrupt the oven and open it just to peer on it in the middle, otherwise it could flop. So we're going to aim for about the hour. If you think your oven tends to be hotter than you would like it to be, then you might want to check it a little bit sooner. But other than that, straight in, straight away to bake. All right, so we'll make sure we set that. Don't want to forget about that at all. It's easy to forget it after that amount of time. And when that's done, I'm going to come back and show you what it looks like, finished product on the plate, and what we can serve it with as well. See you then. It's time. There we go. Look at that. Oh. Festive fruit cake, my favorite. Okay, so look at this browning, this nice little browning we have around the edges. Okay, that's exactly what we're after. Now, in an ideal world, this would sit for at least another 15 to 20 minutes before we cut into it. Reason being is that it'll allow the cake to actually finish cooking in the interior, like most part, if it's not 100% cooked all the way through yet. And this is, I guess, a big success tip for most baking, especially gluten-free baking, and especially a baking which is as dense as this one, so a very kind of heavier fruit cake. It's going to be pretty important to do that. Okay, so I would love for you to be able to let it cool 15 to 20 minutes minimum before you do cut into it. So while I'm going to give it even just a couple of minutes so I can show you the end result, I'll show you some of the other things that I like to serve it with, because you have many options. It actually doesn't even need anything to go with it per se, but if we're going to be all festive and I guess traditional with it, you're probably gonna, those adults you're serving it to are probably gonna want a little bit of alcohol with it if they're having alcohol. So you have options. You could use the regular brandy or rum that most fruit cakes will call for. I like to go something a little bit different, a little bit fancy. And in this case, I'm gonna choose a little bit of apricot liqueur. Now, again, when it comes to liqueurs, you have to be careful because it's pretty easy to find them that are just full of flavors. But I'm just gonna make up a little drizzle. Again, I mean, it's not a lot of alcohol there, but like a little drizzle with a touch of that and a touch of honey. You could use maple syrup as well, but I find the honey is a little bit extra sticky and it suits this a little bit better because we are going to be diluting it with the alcohol. So you could mix up yourself a little drizzle. So we would just need to kind of stir this until we can combine and make this an even texture. So a little bit of honey, a little bit of liqueur, and this could be drizzled over the cut pieces. Probably, I mean, you could do it over the whole cake, but it's probably gonna be nicer if you serve a cut piece and then just drizzle a tiny little bit of this over. So that's the option for the adults. Oh my gosh, that's very apricot-y. So that's one option. The other option you have would be more of a traditional custard. Okay, so if you want to do the custard path, definitely you can serve that. You could serve this with ice cream, ideally like a non-dairy ice cream for those of you wanting to try something a little different. And here's another option, is a little bit of coconut cream. Sorry, not coconut cream, cashew cream. Now, this is literally just soaked cashews that I've put in the blender with a little bit of water, and I might have put a pinch of salt. Just a pinch. So this is what I call a base cashew cream. Now, from this base cashew cream, try say that 3 times fast, I have made a savory dip with it. So I turned a little bit of that into kind of a lemon and dill and garlic dip as a savory dip. And I've reserved this amount, knowing that I could put this maybe on top as more of a sweet dip that it lends itself very well to for this cake. So in that case, like I said, this is just a smooth cashew puree, if you will, done in the blender and done to the point where it's very smooth. So there's no kind of granular bits left in that. And you'll have that happen very easily just by pre-soaking the cashews and then blending them very fine in a blender. Okay, and you will need enough volume in your blender so that it can actually start turning on itself. Okay, blenders don't work too well with low volumes. And I'm just going to turn this into more, like I said, of a sweet version with a little bit of maple syrup, or a lot because it's my favorite, and a little bit of liquid vanilla. So this is a concentrated vanilla extract. So I'll just add a little bit of that to this cashew cream. Okay, and that's probably all it needs. So just a little something to jazz it up a bit. And this could be the option that you drizzle on top instead for the kids or for anyone that's wanting to avoid the alcohol option. That'll still make it just as yummy or decadent without needing to go, you know, ice cream or custard or extra steps like that. Okay? And these can be made in advance. They can be ready to go. If you are baking this fresh, for example, on Christmas Day, those can be ready to drizzle out. So here's how we do it. In this particular dish, this I guess type of bakeware, it's not gonna stick to the edges because it's a silicone, but we might just want to loosen it off by taking the dull end of the knife around it. Okay, and then we should be able to peel it open. Keeping in mind, I really wish, you know, we could have kept this to cool for about 20 minutes before we cut into it. But there we have the festive fruit cake. So let's see if we can get a piece out of this. It might still be a little bit soft in the middle, but we can go into that. I've chosen a serrated knife, so more of like a steak knife to go through this rather than it's a cake knife, I guess you could say. So see, okay, that's our sign that this could benefit from sitting for about another 15 to 20 minutes and cook. Now, this is still done, so you still wanted to take it out of the oven when we did, but this stickiness on the inside of the knife coming from the middle of the cake, I could kind of feel it, is what's happening because I haven't let it sit now for 20 minutes just to finish cooking. So it's just a really big tip when you are doing baking such as this, is to let it sit for about 20 minutes. But let's see, I'll show you what would happen if you didn't let it sit for 20 minutes, because you were just hanging out for this like I am. No, I will let it sit, but just want to show you the difference. Okay, so we'll try and get in there. It's going to be quite soft in the middle, I think. There we go. So you might not be able to tell, but like I said, when it showed you on the knife, there is still that sticky nature to it. Okay, so if this had sat for about another 20 minutes or so, that will be fine. And we don't want to cook it, we don't want to overcook it, because then you're going to end up with a dry cake. You know, if you're going to have some the next day or some later on, you don't want it to go dry. So it's that little happy medium between taking it out of the oven when we've got this nice browning around the edges, whilst then letting it sit to finish cooking in the middle. Okay, so we've got our piece. You can choose your drizzle, however much you want to add on top of there. Give it a little bit of something extra. Maybe we're fancy and we do both. Why not? There we go. A little bit of cream over that. Wow, I made a mess of that. Doesn't matter, it's gonna go in here just the same. So there you are, your festive fruit cake. Tons easier than your traditional fruit cake, I hope you've seen. And I can't wait to see your photos and hear your experiences of having maybe a slightly healthier version of fruitcake this Christmas season. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Cook With Me Live.